Welkom, dames en heren. Goedenavond. Welkom bij dit eerste debat. Ja, hij doet het. Eerste debat in een reeks van 5 debatten over een heel belangrijk, je zou misschien zelfs kunnen zeggen, een van de belangrijkste en grootste thema's van deze tijd, namelijk het klimaatverandering. Mijn naam is Jaap Tielbeke. Ik ben journalist, redacteur bij de Groene Amsterdammer. En ik mag ook veel over dit grote en belangrijke thema schrijven. En we gaan het vanavond hebben over de gevolgen van klimaatverandering. En wat dat betreft is het toepasselijk dat we deze avond hebben gepland op een van de warmste februari-dagen ooit gemeten. Ik geloof dat gisteren was officieel de record ingaan, maar het zou heel goed kunnen dat vandaag... Oké, nou, het record is alweer gesneuveld. Vandaag was officieel de warmste februari-dag ooit gemeten. En Oké, warmste 27 februari. Ja, het is heel goed dat we op de details letten. Het was ongewoon warm, daar kunnen we kort over zijn. En ik las zelfs vandaag een brief van een pensionado. Die schreef van, het is eigenlijk niet zo erg, klimaatverandering mag voor mij wel aanhouden. Want ik kan lekker in de zon met een kopje koffie erbij het krantje lezen. En dat is toch wel een beetje tekenend ook voor de manier waarop we in Nederland nog naar de gevolgen kijken. Het is wel duidelijk dat er iets vreemds aan de hand is. Zeker ook als je bedenkt dat we vorig jaar rond deze tijd nog konden schaatsen op de kanalen. Dus er is echt iets raars aan de hand. Maar toch de gevolgen, echt heel acuut zorgwekkend vinden we die nog niet. En als het dan gaat om de meer alarmerende voorspellingen, dan wordt het toch al vaak in de toekomst geplaatst. Het gaat over de komende decennia, over het einde van de eeuw. Ik weet niet of jullie... Een aantal weken geleden stond er een stuk in Vrij Nederland over de zeespiegelstijging en wat die zou betekenen voor Nederland. Nee, dat leverde inderdaad zorgwekkende scenario's op. Daar ging het ook al over de optie van, dat noemden ze dan gecontroleerde terugtrekking. Wat zou betekenen dat we gewoon moeten accepteren dat West-Nederland op een gegeven moment onder water komt te staan. En dat wij naar Duitsland moeten vluchten of iets dergelijks. Maar meer om aan te geven dat soort echt acuut zorgwekkende scenario's, of dat soort zorgwekkende scenario's vaak nog in de toekomst spelen en een beetje abstract is. Maar we gaan het vandaag ook hebben over de gevolgen in andere delen van de wereld, waar die vaak nu al enorm problematisch zijn en ook echt aan het leven van mensen raken. En we gaan specifiek vanavond hebben over de gevolgen in Zuidelijk Afrika. En de reden dat we dat gaan doen, en dat is ook de reden dat ik nu naar het Engels over ga schakelen, is that we have a special guest tonight, Andrew Mambondiane, and I was told that means he who is king, more approximately. So the expectations are high. And Andrew is a climate journalist from Zimbabwe. He's a prize-winning climate journalist. He wrote a story about a city in Mozambique that was that's threatened to drown due to sea level rise, and he won the Lorenzo Natali Prize from the EU for that piece. And he will tell us some more today also about the effects already feeling in his home country in Zimbabwe. Before he takes the stage, I'd like to introduce the other guests on the podium tonight, who will give also a brief reaction to Andrew's story and tell us a bit about their experiences. Marnix de Bruyne, he's a journalist specialized in Southern Africa. He's written 2 books about it. They're also for sale. One book is about South Africa, where he's also a correspondent, and the other book is about Dutch farmers in Zimbabwe. That's his most recent book, I believe. And he's now an editor at the Dutch journalist platform, The Correspondent. And then we have Nico Wanders. Nico is a research assistant, or assistant professor and a researcher at the University of Utrecht. And you specialized in extreme hydraulics, which sounds to me complicated, but I'm sure you can explain that much better than I do, so we'll wait for your presentation as well. Some practical announcements. We have to wait for perhaps before the break we can have 1 or 2 questions from the audience, but after the break we will also have a presentation by Maurits Groen, who will focus more on the solutions. So don't worry if it's all too gloomy before the break. We'll get to the positive things, we'll get to the solutions after the break, and then we will also have some more time, some more room for questions from the audience. So I'd like to ask you to, if you have any questions, please remember them, and yeah, we'll get to them. And we also have to speak into the microphones, I was told, because this evening is also being live streamed. So that's it for now. Andrew, please take it away.
Okay, thanks a lot. I'm sure you've heard my name. My name is Andrew Mambondia, and I know the surname is a little bit difficult to pronounce, but it's Mambondia. And you know, when before I came here to Netherlands, there are about 10 things I loved about Netherlands. Number 1, the 1998 Dutch soccer team, which participated in the World Cup in France. And number 2, the same team. Number 3, the same team. Number 4, the same team. Up to number 10. So which means when I came here, I only liked one thing about Netherlands. But for me to be comfortable, I used to say, I like 10 things. But at the end of the day, it was only one thing. But when I came here, I learned a lot. Because I've been here for almost this is my 9th or my 10th day. And I've learned a lot about the Dutch life. And I've got to say, and I've got to thank my host. Bram, is he here? I'm sure he's here. He has taught me a lot about the Dutch life. And I'm sure when I leave here on Sunday, I'll be almost 99 point something Dutch. But my story here is not about the Dutch life, of course. You just want to understand what is happening in Africa, especially when related to climate change. But some of the issues I'm going to mention here, possibly they don't make a lot of sense, especially for the Dutch audience. Because some will say, some of you have never slept on an empty stomach. Food is always there. So some of things don't even make sense. So my issue is, some will say, oh, okay, it seems it's all doom and gloom in Africa, but it's not. There are still some silver lining, and there's still hope. I'm sure you hear some of the quite interesting stories, especially when he's going to present some of the solutions. But one of the biggest challenges, especially in Africa, when it comes to climate change, is the severe droughts. I'm sure you have heard about the serious droughts in Africa. And Zimbabwe at the moment is facing a serious drought. And most of these droughts has been attributed to climate change. And besides the droughts, it's like we experience droughts in one season, which are very severe. Another season, we experience severe floods. So the issue is kind of tricky, especially for Africa. And you know, most of the countries, I know you've been following events, especially in Zimbabwe. And one thing I like at the moment is, because when I travel, especially outside Zimbabwe, people will ask me, how is your president, Robert Mugabe? But I know we have got another president, and most foreigners are not able to pronounce his surname. So in the meantime, I'm comfortable because many people are not asking me about that new president because they cannot pronounce the surname Mnangagwa. So we've got another president. But the real issue at times is political issues versus climate issue. That combination, especially for Africa, is a serious issue. So currently, there are serious problems, especially when it comes to food, clean water, and there are some diseases which we never experienced in the past, but because of climate change, we are experiencing those diseases. Like in some cities in Zimbabwe, we used not to experience malaria, but malaria is now there because of climate change. Because the weather, some conditions are getting warmer, which is also good for malaria. And livestock diseases, most farmers are experiencing what they call it January disease. But that disease was only experienced in January when we have high rainfall. But now we are experiencing it throughout the year. And actually, this past year, more than 50,000 livestock died from this disease. And this year, I'm sure some of you have been reading some stories about Zimbabwe. You have seen that more than 5 million people need food aid because of the serious drought. So climate change is a serious issue, especially in Zimbabwe. Of course, you have heard about the story which I did in Mozambique. It was about the rising sea level. So in Mozambique, there's a city called Beira, and that city has been affected by the rising sea level. But I know here in Netherlands, there are some problems related to rising sea level, but the impact is different because we are talking of a poor country which does not have the financial resources to come up with some. Because I remember I visited one of the. Of course, I cannot pronounce the name, but it's one of the most complicated barrier which is stopping seawater from flooding some areas. So we visited that area on about 3 days ago. But a country like Mozambique cannot afford to come up with such technology. That's why the impact, we might have the same problems like droughts. I heard you had some droughts here, but the impact is different. Here you've got the resources. It's different from Africa, where most countries depend on donor funds, and some of these donors cannot give enough money to come up with some programs which can be able to finance such big projects. And we also have a serious problem of migration, whether it's internal or external migration, but it is now a very big issue, especially because of the climate change. People are migrating from lower dry areas to higher areas which are still receiving very, very good rainfall. But the countries are not ready for such migration, whether it's internal, whether it's external. Currently, it's a very, 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 very big issue. So these are some of the major problems which most countries in Southern Africa are facing. But I know I've got quite a few pictures here. This woman is telling me about the effects of climate change. She has got to spend almost every day looking for water. She has got to spend almost every day looking for food. And you know, in Africa, most of the women do the cooking, they do almost every household jobs. So she's spending almost every time looking for food for her children. But of course, she's got a husband, a very nice husband for that matter, but he spends most of this time sitting at home. He does not even help in some of the work related to household. Then I'm sure you can move to the next. This is the impact of the city in Mozambique. This house has been affected by the moving strong waves, and most houses have been built along the coastal areas and they've been affected. I'm sure you can see that barrier. I don't think here in Netherlands you can see such a barrier. You can see something a little bit, something which is more complicated than that one. So you can, or this is it the last? Oh, okay. Yeah. So you can see this farmer. I know this place was so arid, and the farmers could not harvest anything. But you can see, because of a small mini irrigation, the farmers are now able to harvest a little bit of, you can see, it's only that that farmer is not facing this side. But when I took that picture, he was smiling. But of course you cannot see, and you can see is this is a very good bean crop, and this area was so arid that they could not even expect that they could harvest something. But things are improving. Is there another? Oh, okay. So you can see the first this one. Many people they depend on donor for food. So these people are getting food aid from food handouts from USAID. But you know, at times it's not sustainable. People need to grow their own crops. They need to feed themselves. They should not depend on donor funds. But with climate change, I'm sure things will be going to be very difficult for this, considering our political situation. Things are not stable. But we still have a lot of hope. Okay. This man, he was telling me about the effects of drought. One thing about this man, he said, I don't even know whether I'm going to survive the next 5 days. And I interviewed him. That was 2 years ago. I don't know whether he's still alive or not, but I pray he is still alive. But he said, I don't even know whether I'm going to survive the next 5 days. And for the audience like you, such a statement possibly does not make sense. We've got, the food is there, water is there, almost everything is there. But for him, it's a different situation. So I thank you. If there's, I'm sure we will have an opportunity to ask some questions, but remember, I'm a journalist, and I'm used to ask questions, not to answer questions. So for all difficult questions, this panel is going to to answer them. But of course, I will answer some. But what you've got to know, you are asking a journalist who is used to ask questions.
Thank you, Andrew, so much. Well, you are in a panel with other journalists, so we will also be asking you some questions, and the audience, I'm sure, as well. But we'll leave it till the end of the evening. First, I'd like to ask Marnix.
Even vragen. Zou jij een korte samenvatting kunnen geven? Want ik heb een heleboel niet kunnen begrijpen.
Vanwege het Engels? Ik heb geen tijd om hier nu een hele samenvatting te geven van het verhaal. Even kort heeft Andrew zojuist gewoon laten zien op welke manier klimaatverandering, droogte, het stijgen van de zeespiegel in Mozambique direct het leven raakt van mensen, boeren, op een manier die wij hier in Nederland ons heel moeilijk kunnen voorstellen. Maar ik kan niet het hele verhaal herhalen. En we gaan ook de avond voortzetten in het Engels, omdat Andrew ook moet kunnen deelnemen aan de discussie. So, Marnix, I'd like to ask you for a response. You know the region really well. You have not written about climate change specifically, but you have written about farmers in the region.
Yeah, that's right. I published 3 years ago a book about Zimbabwe. Actually, I was tracing Dutch farmers who emigrated to then called Southern Rhodesia in the 50s, and what happened with them since. Many of them turned into successful farmers of tobacco. But then in 1980 there was independence. Mr. President Mugabe started to rule the country, which was quite all right until the year 2000, and then the whole class of white farmers was, for let's say political reasons, to make it very short, their farms were nationalized, they were chased off their land without compensation. So many turned up also reasonably poor. And that had a major impact on the economy of Zimbabwe. As Andrew knows much more about it as well, of course. So I followed the Dutch farmers, but also I was focusing on tobacco farming, which is a fascinating, well, it's very bad for your health, smoking, of course, but it's fascinating crop. And before that, I traveled a lot in South Africa, and I made a book on a small village in the north of South Africa, which is also, so Zimbabwe has it's very good and fertile and also moist parts, but also very many dry parts. In the north of South Africa is also, it can be very dry. Yes, maybe I have one sheet only, and that's this one. And I just typed it in, I must say. It's one of a few figures that was only recently published on the whole area. So the United Nations panel on climate change is actually seeing the region Southern Africa as a hotspot because it's more affected by climate change than generally speaking in the world. So
that's something we often forget, that the effects also about temperature rise are unequally distributed, and so we now already see those regions disproportionately affected.
Yes, exactly. And so this is a quote from, well, you have his name, Tsakani Ngomane. He is from the South African government, and he was talking at this panel. It's only a month ago. And so we are talking about the Paris Agreement that let's try to keep the temperature lower than 2% compared to 1990. But most scientists, I'm sure, elaborated and want to have it lower than 1.5. Now in Southern Africa, it's already 2% higher than a century ago, and it's going twice as fast high than in the other, well, than averagely in the world. And in Botswana, which is an extremely dry country, it's 80%, I think, it's desert. Temperatures are even rising faster. And that was all. That happened while we were sleeping, basically, you can say. Yeah. But then, when Cape Town, which is a huge modern city in South Africa, when they experienced that they run out of water for the first time in history. Almost.
Only recently, right?
Last year, and they just escaped in a way. They were talking about day zero, and day zero was when there was no water left anymore in the dams, they call it, the artificial lakes. Now, so that's the general idea, but then because of this evening, I phoned to two farmers I know in South Africa and in Zimbabwe. And one is, and I just asked their personal experience, and they are commercial farmers, so they were white farmers, so they have huge farms. And maybe, yeah, if there's time, I can just briefly talk about their experiences.
Sure,
yeah, so we have an Afrikaner farmer, Mr. Kosi Elof. He is near the village I was describing in my first book, Soekmekaar. And he's growing avocados, which needs a lot of water. And he sent me the email before I phoned him. So he's mentioning 5 things. So higher temperatures on hot days, more wind, but also it's not only drought, it's also a lot of hail, less rainfall, and then it seems that the seasons moved forward. So it's rainy season starts later. August winds, now we're experiencing late September. But then I phoned him, and he said, but we're still managing. We're actually doing very good, but we take very much care that we don't spill any drop of water. And normally when you do irrigation, you can just run the waters, but he's calculating and to keep it as low as possible. The same thing actually when I phoned a tobacco farmer, a large scale, one of the, well, he's actually a retired tobacco farmer, but he's in the Commercial Farmers Union, what's left of it in Zimbabwe. And before the white farmers were chased away, you had a class of 4,500 large-scale farmers. And they produced a lot of food as well, and tobacco. And then at that time, Zimbabwe was still prosperous. Now the economy is really going down. And he said, you know, and he also had another warning. He said, okay, we also have the same experience. We have erratic rains. Now for tobacco, you have to plant the tobacco seeds more or less 2 weeks before the first rains comes. So it really helps when it's every year on the same thing, so you can predict it. Now, the seasons have become less predictable. So especially for the small town farmers, for the small farmers, that's a big problem. Exactly. Now the big farmers, who still have some money, they have irrigation schemes and they can go around it. And he also said, you know, when I was young, we just called it droughts. Now we call it climate change. But we always had droughts. And he warned also, you know, don't use climate change all the time as a scapegoat.
That's something we'll definitely get into, because that's also one of the challenges of climate change reporting, I think.
When it can be, you know, bad farm policy.
That's always
from the
question,
government.
Like, is it a warm February day because it's just an unusual warm February day, or is it because of climate change? But we'll get into that, because I think that's also an interesting topic when we discuss climate change reporting.
But just to finish that again, when you have access to money, you can prevent a lot of things. You can have irrigation, you can make dams, which happens a lot in South Africa, and they have the technology. But you need money, and you need investment. Now he's experienced difficult because of the economy. There are no foreign currency, so you cannot import all the machinery you need for irrigation. So that's also a problem, and it affects each other.
Globally, the effects of climate change disproportionately harm or affect the most vulnerable and poor, but also within these countries, there are some who are, for whom it's easier to manage the effects than others.
Yeah, and one other thing, well, especially Malawi and Zimbabwe, but also Botswana, well, there's mainly desert there. It's highly agricultural countries with small farmers who really depend on rain, and they don't have the money. For instance, in Zimbabwe, but also in South Africa, you have a very good insurance system. You can insure your crops against hail. And there's now more hail than before, and it's very erratic. But the small farmers, they cannot. And he also mentioning, well, you can elaborate on it, in Zimbabwe, that the government is actually helping small farmers with inputs, fertilizer, seeds, and etc. But there is no government guarantee to protect the crops against hail. And that's what he was proposing to the Zimbabwean government, make insurance for all the farmers, not only the rich farmers can afford it.
Okay. Yeah, I'm curious to hear your thoughts about that maybe later, but first let's go to Nico, who will talk also a little bit more about the effects here in Holland as well, and the comparison to Southern Africa.
Yeah, I thought I put it a bit in perspective. I will go straight to this next slide. I also lecture, so I'm used to having slides. I thought, like, we talk a lot about climate change and hydrology and water available and stuff like that. But I thought I'd show also a bit of the picture of how much we affect actually the world. Not only by, I mean, the Netherlands is famous for having a lot of delta areas. I mean, if you live in this area, you're kind of dependent on it. But if you're living somewhere else in the world, it's not that obvious. So this is our typical natural image. So if you go to the next slide, we were talking about this. It's not moving, so we'll just go to the next one. I guess, yeah, go to the next one, that's fine. Yeah, so here I take some examples of what we actually do to our system. And these reservoirs that you mentioned already in South Africa, we build a lot of them around the world. We use a lot of water for industry, we use a lot of water for domestic, livestock, and then irrigation. And also to pick up on the point that Andrew made, that if you make irrigation, that helps to prevent the droughts, and that's certainly the case. The problem is in a lot of regions we do it irresponsible, so we take a lot of water. If you have a desert area, it's there for a reason, because there's not a lot of rain. So if you're then going to drag up all the groundwater, that's the water that's underneath the ground, basically. In the Netherlands, it's 1 meter deep, but in Zimbabwe, it's many, many meters. And if you do that for multiple years in a row, then you actually drain the aquifers. And that's happening in regions like the US. That's happening in regions like India. That's also happening in a lot of regions in Northern Africa already. And even in the Netherlands in some regions. And that's why some of the coastal regions have problems with salt water. So that's one of the aspects. But it mitigates the droughts, but it's not a sustainable solution. And that's part of the challenges that you face because these people don't have food. You want to provide food, and then you go to an unsustainable solution maybe. There are also sustainable solutions. I think we come to those after the break, so I'll leave those in the mystery box. Yeah, that's one of the problems. I'm not sure what's on my next slide, so we just go for the random. Oh yeah, what I want you to realize, and that's me lecturing again maybe, but that droughts are not like a thing that happens today, only today, in this particular, only in the municipality of Haarlem. It's a thing that's happening across half a continent, multiple countries, or at least a full country. And it's not like one day, it's many months. And it's also, once it's there, it's not gone. The only way to solve it is basically rain. And that's typically the thing you don't have when there's a drought. So you see that there's a problem. So once it's there, it's too late, kind of. Which also makes it very difficult to prepare when you experience a really severe drought. Basically, if you go to parts of Africa, there's only the one thing to do is food aid because agricultural production is gone for that season. That means that people don't have an income for parts of that. Maybe partially, but not everything they want to have. So I put it a bit in perspective on the right-hand side, where I put on the bottom the scales in kilometers and on the y-axis the time scale. So you see it's in the far top right. Way different than a flood, for example, which is a smaller area in a couple of days. Let's go for the next slide, see if there's anything else. Oh yeah, I thought I'd also show you how unequally the things are distributed. All the blue areas are lucky, and all the red areas are unlucky. This is only for the major rivers in the world. So you can see that basically, if you live anything above 60 degrees north, in the Arctic or the northern Russia or northern Canada, you're happy. And that said, this is only for droughts, severe droughts. Happy is relative because it's the snow that is going away. Yeah, the phone is going somewhere. Yeah. Okay, so it's not a very good solution because you get more water, but basically the snow is disappearing. If you look then to southern Africa, you will notice it's not as red as you could expect, but here we only show big rivers. And most of them are basically not located there because it's already quite dry. But I can guarantee you that region is severely hit by the consequence of drought. The Netherlands is intermediately red. So just to give you some sense, we're in the intermediate zone. Definitely not as worse as South Africa, but definitely worse than other parts in the world. And that also shows you a bit, and I don't think I have a slide on it, but I want to pick up on Andrew's point that the things are unequally distributed. We had similar droughts in California, one of the richest states in the United States. We have also a similar drought in the Horn of Africa. The difference between the droughts was not their magnitude, not their severity, not the lack of water. The difference was in California they could still play golf on green fields because they just basically pumped up the water or bought it somewhere else. In the Horn of Africa we had more than 10,000 people dying and food aid. And it's really, for this disaster, it's a money question more than anything else in that sense, and a preparedness question. So how well can you prepare it? So there are definitely solutions that can better prepare you for it, but there's definitely also a money issue involved. So the Netherlands, I don't think anybody has died of the 2018 drought, but I'm pretty sure that if you go to a different region in the world and you have a similar drought, you will see people that have way bigger problems. And that's something we don't always realize. It's the same with sea level rise, as you mentioned. We have a big Maaslandkering or deltawerken. In other regions in the world, they simply don't have the money to put that up. And that's the unfair part where we emit CO2 and other countries, and we all try to reduce it, but it's a global problem, and the consequences are more local than you would acknowledge, but that's I think, my final takeaway point. I don't think there's anything else on this slide.
And so maybe you can give us a small hint about the more sustainable solutions, because what I'm wondering about is, the Dutch proud themselves in being masters of water management, and that's also some of the knowledge we would like to export. What is it that the Dutch can do in these more vulnerable regions to help them deal with droughts or sea level rise, or is it merely a question of money, like you said?
Now, it's partly you could adapt your cropping systems. For example, I will admit straight away that in the Netherlands we're not the best when it comes to dealing with droughts, to be really honest. That's because we're in the, I call it in Dutch afvoerputje, but in the official English word, the delta of the Rhine and the Meuse rivers. We basically get a lot of water all the time. Yeah. So we're very used to having a lot of water, and we use a lot of that water. What we are very good in is managing that water. So once we have it, building all kind of constructions, and that's a thing we definitely export. I work a lot around the world, and you see Dutch hydrologists everywhere. Where basically it's an export product from the Netherlands. And basically building sea protections, that's one of our famous things. For example, the bagger, the excavation ships that basically support the coastal regions around the world. That's something we do pretty well. The issue of land subsidence, so that's veeninkklinking, and we'll translate a bit of the difficult words for you guys. But the land subsidence, basically where we lose land, especially out into the area of Gouda, we have learned how to deal with that. That's something we export as well. And then we have a good knowledge of like how we should do the crops and the forecasting of droughts and making these climate predictions. That's our job. But the real knowledge, we have a country with a lot of water. That's one of our problems, in essence.
So, Andrew, one of the things I was wondering about is how is climate change discussed in the public debate in Zimbabwe in general? Because as we've seen, it has a lot of complex effects, not only to the weather or to drought or heavy rainfall, but also like a contributing factor to even more instability, economic consequences. Is there a lot of talk about, is there a lot of awareness about climate change as a contributing factor or a driver of these issues?
Okay, one of the biggest challenges in Zimbabwe is politics. Because in Zimbabwe we say people eat politics, sleep politics, talk politics. Almost everything in Zimbabwe is about politics. So at times, as a journalist, it's very difficult to convince, say, my editor, if the editor is based in Zimbabwe, to take a climate change story. So climate change is still in the periphery. But when it comes to, because recently we had our elections, no politician talked about climate change during the campaign period. They talk about some other issues, some political issues, but they did not talk about climate change. But I do believe climate change is one of the biggest challenges, especially in Africa. Because I think the next civil war will not be about the control of oil, the control of diamonds, or the control of gold, but it will be the control of water. Because water will be one of the biggest challenges, especially in Africa. But the issue is Africa taking climate change seriously? At times we might say we need investment in coming up with the irrigation or whatever from outside. But at times, are we also putting the few resources we have, especially in irrigation development? But at times, no. So I can say it seems Africa is expecting, like Zimbabwe, is expecting too much from the developed world. But we can also do something using the few resources we have.
But the difficulty, I think, also is that in the discussion in Southern Africa is much more about climate adaptation, where it's like they have limited possibilities to do climate mitigation, so the reduction of CO2, because that's mostly the industrialized developed countries who are, in some sense, especially historically, responsible for the climate change we're seeing now. How do you think we should deal with this, strange tension?
Yes, the most important thing right now is adaptation. Because most politicians are saying, why do we need to reduce our CO2? Do we have the CO2 in the first place, like the the CO2 the developed world used to develop those countries. Because actually they are saying, of course, we can fight climate change, but when it comes to issues like reduction of CO2, I don't think at the moment it's a priority. Because in Zimbabwe, actually, we are developing one of the biggest thermal power station, which is fired by coal. Right now, China is investing almost nearly, it's more than $2 billion in a thermal power station, which is powered by coal. But when internationally, the debate is about reducing the use of fossil fuel, but we are moving towards we are not investing a lot, especially when it comes to the solar energy or other clean source of energy, but we are investing in coal. So at times the most thrust is on adaptation, but some of these adaptation projects, I'm sure you've heard, especially on irrigation, they are not sustainable because they are using water from the rivers, which can also go dry, especially during when we have got serious drought. And we cannot continue, say, pumping water from underground. Definitely it has got also some serious implications. But it's a serious issue, I should say.
And it's also a serious issue for you as a climate journalist. You also play obviously a role in putting it on the public agenda. And we've talked earlier a bit about the challenges to that. And Marnix also mentioned the farmers that are saying, yeah, well, you cannot say that this particular drought is caused by climate change. Yeah. How do you deal with those issues, those complications?
Yeah, especially even if when I'm traveling like this, the first thing I am asked about Zimbabwe is not about climate change. It's about the political situation. So even outside Zimbabwe, there is this interest in about the political situation in the country. Because I was at times you attend a conference on climate change, but the question you are asked about Zimbabwe mostly is about how is the political situation in Zimbabwe. I still remember some other time I attended a conference in USA, Boston. This lady came to me and she asked, hey, you are from Zimbabwe, do you know my sister who lives in Cairo, Egypt? Then I said, oh. Then I said, oh, of course I know her. But do you know my cousin who lives in California? Then she said, how can I know someone in California? But I live in Boston. Then I said, okay, but how do you expect me to know someone in Cairo, which is thousands of kilometers away from? There's this perception that Africa is just a small country. Yeah. So to make that climate change debate a real issue, especially in Africa, at times it's difficult. I should admit, because some people say here, some have never been to Africa, and they think Africa possibly is just a country. So at times to discuss some of these issues, it's difficult, like for a journalist like me, because normally I write for foreign publications, but I need to convince an editor that this is a real issue, especially in Zimbabwe. But at times it's difficult. Yeah. But I know at the end of the day...
Marnix?
Well, no, I was wanting to correct you a little bit. The farmer didn't say like, oh, he was not trying to sort of deny that it was climate change. But he said in the past we also had droughts, and now a lot of changes. But if we had good government policy, we can manage it. Especially when you have the economic resources and the knowledge, so if there is investment, if there's insurance, so you can have, if there's stability. Political, economical stability, if you can import the things you need, then you you do have climate change, but you can adapt and work
Yeah.
around it.
Especially one issue about insurance. Because some companies are no longer taking insurance, especially on agriculture. Because they are now saying it's a very risky business because of the premiums.
The premiums are high.
Very high. So farmers cannot even afford. But if the government is involved, possibly it could be better.
Okay, so Nico, unless you have one pressing thing to add, I'd like to have a couple of questions. We have time for a couple of questions from the audience. Are there any questions?
Kun je nou even een plaatje van het land geven? Ligt het aan zee of liggen de rivieren? Ik weet het niet meer precies.
En over welk plaatje heeft u het nu precies?
You mean
Zimbabwe.
Van Zimbabwe hadden we...
misschien de wereldkaart, hadden we net.
Ja. In Zimbabwe gaat het voornamelijk over...
Zal ik het aanwijzen? Is dat een idee?
Doe dat.
Oké, nou, Zimbabwe ligt hier en het is... I should talk in English, right? It's landlocked, so there's no sea. So
Maar wel rivieren.
yeah, it has many rivers, but a lot of them are dry half of the year. And it has a huge dam and lakes. There is actually... there's a lot of water, and because of climate change, there's a lot of hailstorms which contains water. But if you can collect it in a right way, but you know more about that, I guess.
Yeah.
But yeah, more questions.
Over there, please wait for the microphone.
Oh yeah, okay, thank you. My name is Arnold. And I have been reading a few years ago about this climate problem. And because of climate change, you see what happens really is there are long periods that you have no rain at all or a little bit of rain. But you also have periods that it rains so much that all the ground on the hills, they wash away and nothing stays left and a lot of damage is done. So I think one of the problems you could do is to reconstruct the hillside in a lot of countries. And one organization that does that is Just Dig It. They build holes along the hillside to fetch the water, to slow it down so it doesn't run up fast from the hillside. And the water stays in a ditch, and then the water goes into the ground, into the soil. And apart from that, the seeds are already there, so the green starts coming out of the hole. So the whole hillside, if you dig enough bunds along a hillside, you can catch all the water you want.
I see we're already moving to the solutions. So that's good. Is that a possibility for this region? Do you know this?
Yeah, it's called rainwater harvesting. Basically, you try to prevent the water from running downhill by either digging ditches or greppels in Dutch, or holes or other kind of structures on the soil surface. The problem is that if it's already happened, then you lose a lot of your fertile soil, or have already lost quite a lot of your fertile soil. So if you start too late, in a sense, then it takes a long while before it becomes really productive. But what you say is true. The water infiltrates, and once it infiltrates in the ground, one of the biggest advantages there is it can't evaporate, or at least it doesn't go to sea. When it's in the sea, it's kind of lost for us as humans, at least for agriculture, drinking water, and those purposes. So underground, that's a very good solution. I think that probably is likely in the solutions list of some of these problems. But one of the things, you have to maintain them very well, and have to first start building them and then having local communities maintaining them. But I've seen worked also on some projects in Jordan where they actually actively do this, and you see that it helps. You see green stuff coming up.
All you need is a shovel.
Yeah, you need a shovel, but you need people to maintain them as well, because when water runs in, soil comes in and they fill up. So people have to shovel them out again after each, or not every.
The men have to start working again.
Just one more time, if you have questions or comments, please speak into the microphone, because otherwise the people at home following the live stream can't hear.
But is that happening in Zimbabwe already?
Yeah, in some parts of the country it's happening. That's why I was saying some of these things do not even need donor funding. Do you really need someone to come from outside the country to dig that tunnel, that condo? No. So some of these things, it's about changing the perception of the farmers, especially when it comes to water harvesting and other stuff. So I think it can be done. But,
so, and just if I can ask the final question before we go into the break. You've been in Holland for a week now or so. You've talked to a lot of people, also a lot of people from universities, from Delta Res, water management in Holland. Is there any insights that you gained during this week, or what are the most striking things you've learned or in telling your story?
But I've got to admit, every person I met here in Netherlands, I learned something. Whether it's from the universities, from deltas, or, you know, but the only challenge is possibly some of this technology you cannot replicate it in Africa because it might need a lot of resources. But actually, I learned a lot, especially when I met Nico. I'm not saying this because he's here, but actually, I'm not saying this because he's here, but actually I learned a lot about groundwater, because I was saying, why don't we draw water from the ground and irrigate? But he said, there are some challenges too. So I've got to admit, I learned a lot from quite a number of people. So I'm taking a lot of lessons, but I know the implementation part of it will be the problem because of some political issues. I know he has been there, but he understands some of the situations.
But it's also great to have you here to share your story and to tell the story of the situation in Zimbabwe with us. So thank you for that. Before we go...
Één vraag.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Dika. I'm working with Maasai in Amboseli and in Masai Mara on climate adaptation.
In Kenia.
In Kenya, yes. And actually we are now up into great movement of thousands and thousands of Maasai coming together. And actually we're trying, because I think the biggest problem of the climate change is the land use management. Things are changing so fast in Africa, including the land use, what you're also saying about the farmer. And together with the Maasai, they're really recognizing, okay, if things has to change, we developed a concept which really includes the own culture, the livestock, but also water harvesting, but all together done through the community, by the community, and close to the knowledge they have. And actually, though, those methods don't cost a lot of money. Okay. They're quite cheap, and they're so close to their own way of living. They need their hands, they need the cows, they need some fences, and they need some training. And actually, that's it. And it includes a lot of things.
Can I ask you, the traditional knowledge they have, does it help when you have such major changes?
Yes. Because I know that everybody in Holland is against livestock, but livestock is really helping into adaptation of climate change. But then you have to do it in a slightly different way, not in a totally different way, but in a slightly different way. And then you can use your livestock, but you can use permaculture. You can learn how the soil is working, earth is working, anti-erosion measures. Very easy. Just put some sticks, some branches in your gullies, and you already have, like, in 2-3 months, your whole soil covered with grass again. You know, I mean, it's such an easy, simple method. And it's also Zimbabwe. I was looking it up in the Wenge. There's somebody who's doing exactly the same. Okay. I can give you the name, and it's low cost, community involved, everything, and it has very good results.
Marnix, I can taste you're still a bit skeptical, but maybe that's something you can discuss in the break as well, and Andrew perhaps as well. Before we go to the break, I'd like to ask on stage someone from a restaurant nearby, the Wereldkeuken, who has a surprise for us, I think.
Hi, goedenavond allemaal. Ik ben Annemarie van de Wereldkeuken. Wij hebben een restaurant hier voorin in de Pletterij. Ja, we zijn hier eigenlijk gevraagd om de hapjes vandaag te verzorgen. En nu we dat toch doen, wil ik graag ook iets over de Wereldkeuken vertellen. 7 jaar geleden heeft mijn collega Mirjam de Wereldkeuken als initiatief geopend. Het was de bedoeling om door middel van koken en serveren nieuwe Haarlemmers, op wat voor migratieachtergrond je ook hebt, te helpen integreren in onze maatschappij in Haarlem. Dat werkt eigenlijk heel goed. Ze werken mee op vrijwillige basis. En buiten het koken en serveren bij de Wereldkeuken hebben we ook nog een wereldmoestuin. Nou, je snapt dat producten uit de tuin komen bij ons ook weer in de keuken terecht. Dan hebben we een naaiatelier, een kunstlessen en we gaan bezig zijn met sport. En om al dat te kunnen financieren, hebben wij dus onze menus in de Wereldkeuken. We organiseren ook cateringen. En we zijn heel erg... we moeten heel veel fondsen en donaties krijgen om ons hachje te kunnen redden, zeg maar. Dus dat een beetje over de Wereldkeuken zometeen. Mijn collega Mohammed, die is er vanavond niet. Maar die heeft wel heel erg lekker hapjes voor jullie gemaakt. Dus die zal ik jullie zo serveren. En dan hoop ik dat jullie ervan genieten. Dankjewel.
Dankjewel. 9:15 gaan we weer verder. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I see there are already lively discussions. Some people are still at the bar. But we also would like to continue the discussion on stage. So if you could get your drink and take a seat, then we can continue. So, all right. As promised, after the break, we're now going to talk about, focus more on the solutions, and we'll do that by starting off with a presentation by Maurits Groen. And Maurits, maybe some of you have already heard of him. He's a prominent name in the Dutch sustainability scene. He started out as a journalist, but he's also a long-time experienced consultant when it comes to sustainability issues. He's the founder of multiple organizations and company, including Waka Waka, that produces solar-powered LED lights. So I think he's going to provide us with very interesting insights. And I'd say, Maurits, the floor is yours.
Maybe I stand up because talking to an audience not standing up is not so polite, I think. It's working. Talking about solutions. Actually, I think that's hard because I'm not a very happy, clappy person that only talks about solutions, whereas the problems are huge and getting bigger and more severe. The word climate change has been used here for, I think, 50 times this afternoon, this evening. I never use the word climate change because we're talking about climate disruption. Change is very neutral, disruption is not, and words matter. So when I'm talking about solutions, I always do so in the context of a big and a growing and a very urgent problem. And it seems often when we debate about climate disruption that it is our choice to do something or not to do something, like if the laws of nature, which we're dealing with, are laws that we can change or abolish or amend or whatever. And that's not the case. So where we are talking and while we are not acting, nature just responds to our actions. And last year, of course, again, not only we had the weather records every time and again, but we also emitted more greenhouse gases than ever before in the history of mankind. And that's 3 years after the Paris Agreement, which was a wonder in itself. So I've been, like you said, starting to be a journalist in environmental matters in the 70s already. And we wrote about climate disruption by then also. And we knew what was happening because it's about laws of nature. And not much has happened. And still not much is happening. In 2006, I became a publisher by chance, not by choice. because nobody in the Netherlands wanted to publish the book by Al Gore. Nobody. No one single publisher wanted to do that. So I translated it myself together with a colleague, and the same was true for the film. Nobody wanted to screen the film. And then I organized a premiere in Tuschinski, and the Prime Minister came, and then it became an issue. But that's 13 years ago. And our missions are...
The name of the movie?
An Inconvenient Truth, of course, by Al Gore. Everybody knows that, I guess, by now. Okay. So then I started to, like you said, to establish companies that actually continued communicating about the problems, but especially about the solutions, by doing something about the problem. Because people listen more to what you do than to what you say. Like children look more to what their parents do than to what they say they should do. So I started a company on, like you said, on solar power, not only light, but also power banks that you can charge your phone with, or your radio, or whatever. Since a lot of African people still live in energy poverty, and when our choice is, or our insight, that they should not, that they should skip the fossil fuel era and immediately start like they did with mobile phones, instead of laying the landlines like we did 100 years ago, immediately turn to solar. And Africa, like you said, is a huge continent, and it has a lot of sun, whereas solar is, in contrary to coal, oil, gas, which will be running out, apart from causing a lot of problems, it's about eternal. It is delivered at your doorstep every day for free, and it's safe at the same time. So why don't we turn to that solution right away? So I produce that Waka Waka, which is a strange name. Of course, it's African. It's Swahili, shine bright. But then again, the food system is an even bigger problem, because you can do without power. It's difficult, but you can. But without food, it's getting really, really difficult. And our food system is disastrous for the planet, disastrous. Our chicken, our cows, our pigs, they eat away the Amazon rainforest in the form of soybeans that we plant after we cut the trees and we set fire to them. So I don't have much time, so I make it very condensed. So I started a company called Kipster, which produces eggs and chicken meat, which is the animal protein with the smallest footprint, without any footprint, because we do not grow any food for the chicken. They only eat so-called waste. That's part of the solution. 100 years ago, there was not one single chicken farmer in the world. There wasn't a pig farmer in the world. Of course, farmers had chicken and they had pigs, but only to the extent that they had waste, or that the chicken could run around, find their own food. We didn't grow any food for those animals. And that's a natural system. So we should go back to that, which means that we should eat much less meat, if at all. It's not healthy if we do so. So by producing alternatives, and I can mention some more, I won't because of the time. By producing alternatives, I try to show that it's possible. One of the later things is, and that's what I'm going to talk about, is a book called Draw Down. Is there anyone in the room who has heard about the book? Yes, several ones. Draw down is a word which describes the moment in time that the concentration of CO2, which is a greenhouse gas, goes down. In the pre-industrial era, the concentration was 270 parts per million in the air. It's now 410, whereas the safe level is 350. We're approaching the 450 mark very rapidly. We will cross that quite soon, actually, I think. And that will mean that we will cross the 2 degrees centigrade level. Even if mankind would be able to fulfill and implement all the agreements, all the promises that they made in Paris, we will still cross the 3 degrees threshold. And one of the books that I published after Al Gore's book was called 6 Degrees by Mark Linus. He was a journalist from England, a scientific journalist, and he had a gigantic task for himself, set for himself, to go through all the literature that was available by then, that was 10 years ago, to see, to evaluate what the consequences would be if the global or the regional general concentration, the general temperature would rise 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 or 6 degrees. 3 degrees is almost permanent disaster, you could say. We are going to cross that threshold, even if we implement all the plans that we have promised to do in time, which we all know we won't. The book Drawdown describes the top 100 solutions, top 100, there's many more, top 100, 80 ones that are already on the shelf, are already implemented, are very profitable to implement, that exist today, and 20 actually are what they call coming solutions, coming attractions, already in the pipeline, already proven, but not yet implemented on a scale that you can implement on a large scale. So the top 80 solutions can already, for a very large part, 3/4, solve the problem. So what's the problem? Because that book has a structure which has been able to calculate to a very deep degree of certainty what the investment would be globally, from now up to 2050, and what the return would be in financial terms. On average, it's 250%. So the return is 250% on your investment, financially, let alone that you prevent a lot of costs that you run into when you have the consequence of climate disruption upon you. And that is only damages. That's not investment in the future. The very strange or the surprising thing is that a number of those solutions, a number are very, very ordinary. We know all that. We should not cut down rainforest. Our peatland, we should not drain it from water, etc. We should have silvopasture, we should have agroforestry, we should have all those kind of things. But the number one solution, which surpasses all wind turbines and all solar power combined and all electric cars together, is the prevention of cooling agents in our fridges, in air conditioning agents, and in cool houses, warehouses, to escape into the environment. Because when we had the Montreal Agreement about the CFKs, to prevent the hole in the ozone layer to get bigger, we did that very rapidly. But we replaced those CFKs with HFCs, a chemical agent which is not harming the ozone layer, but it does act as a very potent greenhouse gas. 1,000 to 9,000 times stronger than CO2. And there's a lot of those around. So if we take care of that, and we invest in recycling, etc., and destruction in a good way, in an environmentally safe way, we prevent a lot of problems. The number 3 is the prevention of food waste. 1/3 of all food globally, 1/3, is not being eaten after having been produced, which takes a lot of water, which takes a lot of resources, energy, etc., etc. Capital, 1/3. And in developing countries, that loss takes place in the beginning because there's no good storage facilities, the infrastructure is bad, so you lose a lot. And in developed countries, it is us, the consumers, that just throw away. We do not consume. Or we throw away after half having been consumed, not all of it that we have made for ourselves. 1/3. So if we would do a little bit clever with that, that's a huge contribution to solving that climate problem. Number 6, very surprising, education of girls in developing countries. There's 130 million girls that do not have one single day of education. Not one. If they would, primary, secondary education, it has been calculated in this book, that would prevent the birth, it sounds a bit silly, but to prevent the birth of 483 million births, which means almost 1 billion people that will not consume all the things that we do, which will prevent a lot of conflict for all those scarce resources. Apart from women leading a fuller life, having other possibilities than only having 8 children, of which half dies, and the other 4 are necessary for old age pension income for the people in their old age. Just like us. Very surprising solutions and sometimes very, very ordinary. All the solutions are here. And when talking about solutions, I'm enthusiastic about it. I'm at the same time very, very angry at the politicians that disregard all the solutions that are there. The short-termism is blatant. All the solutions are there, they're profitable, but they just do not want to propagate, to tell about it and to rally the people behind it. They just do not want to show us what's ahead. And again, talking about solutions, happy clappy, they are all there, they're profitable. If we do not, the consequences will be upon us. So it's 2 side coins. When you want to solve a problem, you first have to convince people that there is a problem. And if you paint the picture too dark, people will give up. They will run to despair, from denial to despair. So that's not a positive thing. If you only talk about solutions, people think, well, that will be solved. We don't have to do anything with it. So it's a really subtle scale what to do. You have to alarm people, but not to the extent that they panic. You have to motivate them to do something by showing that it can be done and it can be profitable. And actually, the lead author of this, he's been in the Netherlands, and then that's what I'm ending with. The lead author was here last month at my invitation. And he said, after having talked about all these solutions for more than an hour, he says, even if climate disruption did not exist, even if we would not have any of those problems that he's been talking about, this would be the life that we would like to live. This is like we would like to choose, no matter what the problems. So why don't we do that? Thank you.
Thank you, Maurits. Yeah.
This is the book, by the way.
It's impressive to see that you're certainly maybe not a happy, clappy person, but someone who understands the enormity of this problem, but still manages to remain hopeful. But maybe one brief question before we go to the reaction is also then the question: if we know what the solutions is, then why? Maybe the question is not what are the solutions, but why don't we implement it? Why is it that politicians are stuck in this short-termism?
There's many answers to that, of course. One, of course, is that politicians want to be chosen again, and it takes a lot of courage, knowledge and courage, and to perseverance to put things on the agenda when they're not really nice and funny, and when the gain is not around the corner, when you have to persevere in order to really make an impact. That's one thing, of course. And then again, there's a lot of, I'm not a conspiracy person, but there's a lot of vested interest in the current system. even today, we invest 400 billion every year in new fossil fuel installations, new ones. The agriculture that we have is massively addicted to fossil fuels. Fertilizers, pesticides, machinery, processing equipment, it is all fossil fuel based. So it takes a lot of
It's also powerful
system
losers.
change. Sorry?
There are powerful losers, potential losers if we make the transition.
Yeah, that's a good summary of it. Yeah.
Okay, so I was wondering maybe Andrew and Marnix, if you could give a reaction to something you mentioned, like the question, should Africa or African countries follow the Western path of development, or can they like skip the fossil fuel stage? You've mentioned that in Zimbabwe there's still a lot of coal-powered infrastructural projects. How do you view this, Marnix?
Well, I know it from a very small scale. This small-time black tobacco farmer can only phone to me because he has a small solar system in his hut to recharge his phone. So it's not only using energy, but it's also your connection to the world, basically, by small solar systems. And they're affordable. I mean, if he has a good crop, then he can buy it. And he did. So it is happening a lot already, I think. But a general thing like getting girls into classes, it's a bit more long-term solution, of course. But if you raise the middle class, if you want to send your children to school, it helps if you don't have too many children. So that's a way to get less population. Yeah, I see that solution.
What's your view on these two issues?
Okay, I'm sure he mentions something he calls waka waka. It might appear to be a very simple gadget. Of course, I'm not saying this because possibly I'm trying to convince him to give me a job or whatever, or even to be one of his salesperson. But I've got to tell you, it's a simple thing which can make a difference in the life of an ordinary person, especially in Zimbabwe. Because most rural communities don't have electricity. And the children, especially during the day, they help in doing household work. And they've got to do their homework at night. But without that light, they cannot. They cannot use firewood to read. So they depend on solar energy, like such that simple gadget. I think, I'm not sure whether you've got plans to distribute to every corner of Africa. I know it's not possible, but I hope you try your best. Or I already have one, so it means you are no longer going to give me anyway, but but I know you try your best, because it's a very important thing, especially for children in Africa.
Are there any questions from the audience? And there's a microphone back there, so please raise your hand and then come to you. There's a lot of discussion during the break, so I'm pretty sure you will have something to add over there.
I'm Dick Wolf from the Stedenband Haarlem-Mutare. I've been lots of times in Zimbabwe, and I saw the eucalyptus tree a lot. And I'm wondering if that is a form of forestry, or is it a form of disaster?
Disaster.
Yeah. And can you explain that?
It sucks a lot of water. It's bad for the soil.
Okay, thank you.
But it makes very nice trees, and it grows fast, and it's used for wood.
Is it also used for the compensation of CO2? Because you heard sometimes about these projects where you plant forests in order to compensate CO2 emissions.
They're not indigenous, so they're not good for the environment where they're planted.
Yeah. Do you recognize this?
Yes, because actually most of the tobacco farmers or the tobacco companies, because most of the tobacco is cured by wood, so these tobacco companies are encouraging farmers to grow eucalyptus, which of course is not good for the environment. Because actually it's not an indigenous tree, and most is they are planted in even in wetlands, but they're sucking all the water out. So I don't know whether...
Can I add a little bit, because you mentioned the word, you have to cure tobacco. It's like drying tobacco, and you use heat, and you do it with wood. And now the commercial farmers raised blue gums, which is like eucalyptus, to use it. But when they were chased away and the new small farmers came to the grounds, they also had to cure the tobacco, and they preferred the indigenous trees, which are growing slow, but they're also burning slow, so you need less trees. But that meant as well that a lot of trees disappeared, and they don't come back. Yes. So again, you have the economical problem who creates a huge environmental problem. And I don't know what to do about that.
Another argument for not smoking.
Yes, gentlemen and ladies and gentlemen, please stop smoking.
So to get back to the list of solutions Maurits mentioned, I'm curious to hear your view on this as a scientist. Is there anything missing from the list, or is there anything new?
I'm pretty sure in the 100 options list there's pretty much everything you can think of, or at least the obvious things. But what I want to add to that, and I think it was not in your like 1 to 10 maybe, but one of the things that you mentioned, but not specifically mentioned as a solution, is awareness. That people are aware of the problem, and not only here in the Netherlands, but also in other parts of the world, what the consequences are of emitting a lot of CO2 and greenhouse gases. And that if we stop it today, that it will not stop melting glaciers or melting the polar ice caps, because that will continue for a number of decades. And then at some point you reach a stable situation. That is the new normal, but you will have this, we call it the overshoot, but at least at some point you will have these effects will continue. So if you stop today, it's not the aspect. And the one other thing that is also quite complicated, we mentioned eucalyptus now already, but we mentioned agriculture a lot, we mentioned energy, but there's this thing called the food, water, energy nexus, where all these three components are actually very much interlinked. If you want to have energy, you need water to cool your factory or even your hydropower dam. If you want to have agriculture, you need water. If you want to do agriculture, you also need energy. And if you need food, basically, to support all the other aspects. So that these three components are very much interlinked. So you can't affect one without the other. So that's also an interesting thing that we now, as scientists, try to grasp more and more and see how these things, and not only in one country, but around the world. So it was mentioned that we take our food from the Amazonian rainforest, for example. So what we ever use or produce here is not necessarily coming from here. And we have such a thing as a hydrologist, we call it the water footprint. So if I eat my beef here, that means that thousands of liters are abstracted somewhere else. So it doesn't mean that the Netherlands is suffering in that sense, but we basically import water, and there are countries in the world that are net importers and exporters of water. And the unfortunate thing is...
In the shape of soybeans.
Yeah, and soybeans, meat, fruits, cotton is very bad in that sense. And we export quite a lot from developing countries to the developed world, because we don't have enough land area to do that.
So we also need to raise awareness of that interconnectivity.
Yeah, so I think that's one of the other issues that is, I mean, we're having a whole, it seems like a depressing session here, but I think it's good that that awareness part is quite good, that you are realizing what certain choices could be and could be.
Thank you. Any more questions from the audience?
I have a question to Maurits. We have a lot of discussion in the Netherlands about the cost of the climate agreement. You say there are a lot of solutions and they're cost neutral, or they have benefits. What's the main difference between these two approaches from the climate accord and the book you mentioned?
Well, first, I wanted to already talk about, we even did not finish yet, about the word costs, because we should stop talking about costs. We should start talking about investments and preventing damage. That's a completely different view on things, a completely different set of glasses that you put on. Because if you scare people that it will be very costly, they will lose sight of what's really going on.
We don't talk about the cost in that in that frame. We don't talk about the cost that would happen if we don't take any action, if we don't have any policy.
Yeah. So if we have an integral approach, a systemic approach like you promote, and I completely agree with you, then that's painting a completely different picture. So we should start, like this book, I published it because I want to change the concept. I want to change the way people view the situation we're in, the things that we can do. We talk about problems and costs, whereas we should talk about a perspective like I ended. This is the life we want, and we invest in the life we want. And in the same time, we make people happier, we avoid a lot of costs, and it's also a financial investment that's reaping even financial rewards.
So, again...
Let's use other words. We use disruption and we use investments. But when we look at the measures that are in the climate agreement and the measures that are in the book, what's the main difference in approach?
Well, for example, I will take a very concrete example. You know Agenda, I'm part of that organization also. We convert homes into energy neutral, energy positive homes. And it costs about 35,000 euros. That's a lot of money. But you will have earned that back, it's an investment, within, say, 15 or 16 years. Because that's the amount of money that you spend on buying gas, on heating your home, and buying electricity. And when you make it energy neutral, you use the investment to invest in a future where after year number 16, 15, 16, you do not have an energy bill ever again until you die. I mean, we're talking about a huge investment because we have 7 million homes. 7 million times 30,000, 35,000 is a lot of money. But in the big scheme of things, it is not. We are very much used. I mean, nobody in this room can pay for a home, buy a house, just by his pocket money or putting it out of his pocket. We have a mortgage. We have invented a mortgage. Why can't we have an energy mortgage, which has a lead time of less than half a normal mortgage, which is about 30 years?
Sorry,
I mean, it's the way we look at things.
It reminds me of this cartoon where you have a conference and then there's somebody saying, what if it's all a big hoax and we are creating a better world for nothing?
For nothing.
So, yeah. So there was another question over there.
Well, you were talking about education for girls in Africa and about the possibility of 480 million people who you can sort of detract from the total. But is there, how is the research about the global scale for something like this because of the population growth? Because you have so many solutions and we're talking about so many different things which you can do to either use less water or all the other solutions, but in the end, it's if you have like 10 billion people, how do you still achieve all that?
We will never have 10 billion people.
No, but for example,
the system cannot sustain that.
Yeah. But the general question is a valid one, I think. What's the connection between population growth and environmental crisis? Marnix, you've written, I don't know, you've written about population growth at least. Is that something you want to comment on?
Well, no, that's in a way a political question, because it's too easy to say we solve all the problems by having less population, because you can adapt also your policies and your agriculture, and you can try to get more food out of every hectare and then still feed more people. It's a bit too easy. For instance, if you look at Africa, there's often used as a kind of scaring people in Europe. Look how fast the population is growing in Africa. But the amount of people they expect in worst case scenario in Africa in say 2050, it's already the amount of people that are living now in much smaller area in Europe. So I mean, it's also not fair to
so how do you
use it this way.
Because when it comes to population growth control, it's usually pointed to Africa or developing regions where the population growth is highest.
But in Zimbabwe at the moment, the issue of population is not yet a real issue.
No, it's going down actually.
Yeah, actually it's going, yes. It's not, because if you look at our current population, it's around 14 million. And normally they said we still have, in terms of natural resources or land, we still have a lot of land, and we should not talk about, say, climate change and population growth at the moment. But I know when it comes to getting the resources, even though we've got only 10 million people, are they accessing, do they have food, do they have clean water, do they have access to education or access to health? But at times, it's not about having a large number. If we might have only 2 people in Zimbabwe, but if they are not accessing education, health, do we say, okay, we are happy because we are only 2 people, but are we accessing the needs, or do we have the education, or do we have the water, do we have the food? Because we cannot say we are just the two of us, but we are hungry, then of course we are okay. So at times the issue of population vis-a-vis the needs, or the like food and whatever, it's a little bit
unfair.
Yeah, it's a yes.
Okay, I have the feeling that you did you have something to add?
It's not about using Africa as a scapegoat, for example, because of maybe the population growth over there, but just in general, in the global population, and what maybe are other parts of the solution. And I know it's not, like you were all talking about, it's not the entire solution, of course, because there are so many things, but this is just one of the things we can, in my opinion, can help so much compared as well to the other things.
That's an important but a whole complicated discussion as well. So unless somebody has one pressing comment or answer on that.
One little addition, when we talk about overpopulation, I think it's very important to stress, because people always look to Africa, people 8 children, etc. The footprint per person in Western Europe, or let alone in the United States, is much, much, much bigger than an African. So the overpopulation in terms of resource use in general is here. Let's be clear about that.
Okay, so maybe 1 or 2 last questions, and then I was told that there are also 2 school children here that were part of the climate strikes, and so these are really school children that weren't just went there to have a day off, but they're actually involved in this issue and they're here tonight, and I would like to give them a brief moment also to share their thoughts on this evening and the problem. But before we go to them for the final comments, are there any more questions from the audience?
Yeah. Just one. Since I'm a new politician, so I'm not really... I just want to ask, like, Mauritsgroen, don't you expect too much of the politicians? There's not much... well, of course, we have the measurements we need to take, but we're just, like, into a very... part of a very old structure. And we need to navigate into this system. Of course, we try to navigate, but we need more help.
It's surprising that a politician asks for help, because I think the role of politician is to address the issues that society faces and to be clear and honest about it. And I think at the moment the debate is being diverted from where the real issues are. And I'm not pointing to the politicians in general, because we have very good politicians as well. But I think that's the role of politicians. In the 80s, for example, and Boat knows that very well, who's next to you. In the 80s, it was the government that appealed to industry to take its responsibility. Now it's the other way around. For example, even Shell, to just name a company, for their internal decisions on whether or not to invest in a certain project, they will calculate a CO2 price of 60 euros per ton. 60. It is now 5. So they will not admit to a new proposal for an investment if it cannot withstand a possible future CO2 emission levy of 60 euros. And this is in the whole of the industry. So why don't the politicians take that step? It is being asked by the industry to do that. I mean, we have a CO2 discussion at the moment because there's, of course, several industries, high ovens, for example, that will be hurt about that, by that. So we should make it a very clever exception for keeping the very relatively clean ovens here instead of importing dirty steel from elsewhere, for example. But the rest of the industry, it has been calculated, can very well even profit from that CO2 levy. Actually, the free riders, the companies that do not invest in innovation, in sustainable energy, in efficiency, etc., they are being punished because the free riders can have a go. So it is very detrimental that we uphold this system, and this is something that government should do. Industries cannot do. They are waiting for they're even stating that publicly. Even Shell does that. So that is where politicians should come in.
Okay. So it's up to you, policymakers. One final question from the audience, and perhaps by.
Yeah, actually, I have one last question for Andrew. You said you write about climate change or climate disruption, as we heard, and at the same time, you said politicians are not really. It's not really an issue on the agenda. So I was wondering how decision makers respond to your work. Actually, do you reach them, or how do you raise awareness in your country for this topic?
Yeah, but actually, you know, politicians at times, when it is good for them, they can start talk about an issue. But when it is not, then they... Because when it comes to... Zimbabwe has got possibly how many climate change policies? About 3. Yeah, the policies are there, but at the end of the day, is there any implementation going on? Because they are silent, especially on the issue of implementation. But they've got very good blueprints on climate and climate change. But the issue is on implementation. They prefer to give the resources to other issues than giving it on. And the terms prevention in Zimbabwe, they don't want to prevent, because otherwise they are interested in photo shoot. You know, when there's a disaster, they go there, they appear as if they are helping, then it becomes good for them. But imagine they come up with some programs to say, looking at issues to do with hunger, and there's no issue about food donations and whatever. Do you think the politicians will have an opportunity to come and say, we have brought you this? Because normally they will say, we are bringing you this food, it's because of us. And so at times, it's all about implementation. Yes, the policies might be there, but is there the political will to implement those? And of course, we know we should expect a lot from our politicians, but that's why we elect them, because they should lead in some of these projects. And
do you have the feeling that your work as a journalist contributes to that, to put it more on the agenda, or to?
Yeah. At times, you know, of course, one frustrating issue at times is we try to raise some of these issues, and that's why we go to the people. Because at times the people cannot talk directly to the politicians. They can talk through us as journalists. At times the politicians, some are level-headed, I should say. Yes, they can listen to some of these problems, but in some cases it's so frustrating. You do quite good stories, but you know there's little in terms of action, especially on the ground. So, yeah, of course we know. They read, but at times they don't act. So what's missing is the action part. Yeah, of course they might read, but they just see, don't act on some of these issues. So at times it's so disappointing.
We end on a gloomy note, but maybe there's still hope, because, like I said, we have two scholieren, klimaatspijbelaars of klimaatstakers. The school children that we were telling you about, they were on strike to put the issue on the political agenda here. And I was wondering if you had some thoughts you wanted to share on this evening, or maybe a question for the audience. If you prefer to do it in Dutch, that's also fine. Yeah?
Well, no, I'm fine. I'm fine here, no.
Maybe give them an applause.
Thank you. No, I think we're really glad to be here, because I hope our generation can be a part of the solution. And as we made clear by demonstrating, I think it's very clear that we grew up with the thought of climate change, or climate disruption, sorry. And we are educated on this, so I think we will, and I hope we will be the generation to solve this problem.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's because we've been, we grew up with more awareness than the generation before us, and we have more knowledge about the subject because it's become an issue that's become, well, on the agenda. And I think that's very promising, because that way we can, I think there are a lot of, well, people that are invested from our age, that have very promising ideas, and I'm very interested into what our generation is going to give. And I also had a question. Obviously, there's a lack of money in Zimbabwe, but let's say we did have the money. Let's say we did have the awareness in politics, especially. what would we need to prioritize first? Like, should we invest in? Should we invest in irrigation methodology or in hazard management or research for solutions, other solutions? What should we prioritize first?
The two people left on stage are perfectly suited to answer that question. And then, so I'd like to ask you to keep it a bit brief because we already ran out of time.
Okay, mostly because in Zimbabwe, about say 80% of the population, they're involved in agriculture. But normally this agriculture, they depend on the rainfall. So we should find ways of making agriculture sustainable. You know, even if we come up with better crops, irrigations, and most of the investment should be centered on agriculture, because that is the livelihood. Yes, of course, we can also invest in things like solar energy, clean energy, and whatever. But we should look at how to improve the food sustenance and how best can we make people be able to produce without depending on rainfall.
Something you'd like to add?
Maybe education and awareness. I think that also helps, that people are aware of it. And I think journalists can help there.
And you can help as well by protesting. 10 March, the climate march in Amsterdam, that also helps by raising awareness. Thank you all very much. Thank you also, Maurits and Marnix. Give them a warm applause. And thank you for being here. This was the first of 5 debates. There'll be a couple coming up. We're going from the global to the national to the local level. So we hope to see you at those debates as well.
Ja. Dames en heren. Dames en heren, er is een mobieltje gevonden. Ik weet dat die dingen tegenwoordig bijna niks meer kosten, maar om zo... Oké.